not born in Italy. Also, it blows my mind when you said favorite cannabis brands. I'm like, wow, because I'm from the East Coast. So favorite cannabis brand used to be like you go to the guy in the park and you get the stuff that's 3/4 oregano. So God bless, you're living in a different time. Good stuff. So a little bit, first of all, you guys are mostly interested in getting into the industry, right? Okay, great. So hopefully this talk will help just in terms of giving you an understanding of the history, mainly because it's interesting. I mean, the regulations are going to change a lot, but still I think it's a good background for you guys to know. As for me and my background, I did my PhD in history here at UCLA. My dissertation and book was actually on the beginning of drug control. Anyone know when drug laws first hit the books?
70s?
Anyone else?
40s, 40s, 30s,
1914. 1914. There you go. So 80s close. No, people often assume it's 1970. We'll get to that, but 1970 was actually saying like the old laws weren't good enough. Let's make some new ones, and that's the ones that are on the books now. Anyway, so my PhD's in history, did all that. However, you can't get a job working as a historian unless you're willing to go to like Southwest Montana State because there's no jobs. So I kind of did what PhDs in history often do, which is start doing whatever it is you study. So I was studying drugs. So I now work at Integrated Substance Abuse Programs, which is a research center actually in the psychiatry department here at UCLA. And we look at addiction mainly from the perspective of health. So particularly the idea that like when you go to your doctor, you guys when you go to the doctor, does the doctor ever ask you how much you drink? That kind of thing. That's because of research that eggheads like me do that figured it out. Like that's actually a good way to catch people who are having problems early. Trying to do that with drugs as well. And cannabis, I think it's really interesting because of the fact that it can be problematic, but as you know, it can also be really good. And there's a lot of wiggle room in between. So with that, that's me. Also, I agreed to give this talk, then I got roped into an event that had me talking all day today, so I'm tired, so I'm sitting on the table. So apologies for that. Feel free to interject anytime, it's kind of history lecture-y, but let's make it as much of a discussion. Any points, questions that come up, happy to stop and have discussion along the way. So with that, what I'm going to do is provide an overview. Also, you let me know if I'm like running ridiculously over time. Then I'll shut up. So I'm going to start with a little bit about the history of psychoactive substances. And by psychoactive substance, what we mean is pretty much anything that affects your brain, cognition. And the reason I'm starting with that as an overview is because to look at the history of cannabis itself doesn't really make sense unless you're also looking at the history of alcohol, the history of opium. And how is it that we came to view each of these substances differently? Because the big question that people have, and that really we're going to address here, is we know cannabis isn't that bad for you, so why was it so illegal for so long? There is a history, and that's kind of what we're going to cover here. Then from there, going a little bit into the history of cannabis, and then the development of Prohibition. So to start, why do we have some drugs that are illegal and some that aren't? Yeah.
Whether or not they have medical applications.
Okay, so one thing is if it's medical or not. So if we feel like it's something you can use to actually cure an illness or some kind of symptom relief, right? What are some other ones?
Special interests.
Special interests?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Pharmaceuticals.
Expand.
In the sense that, pharmaceuticals have control as far as medicinal applications for certain symptoms or diseases, and they would really want to do their best to stop cannabis from growing.
Right, so the idea that if I have the market, say I invented Tylenol, and then you invent ibuprofen, I'm going to do everything I can to say ibuprofen's bad, don't do it, because I have the market right now. Special interest, that very much plays a role. Other things? Yeah?
Who's using it?
Who's using it? What do you mean by that?
Like which groups of people do you often associate a drug with, or who is using it as a need or a desire and why? And I guess just who.
And it ties in with why also.
Yeah.
So this question of who's using it, because of the fact that if, say, there was a substance that like we associated with a certain underclass or certain kinds of people that we consider dangerous, maybe that would be a substance we would want to consider doing something about it. Historically, this is very much what happened. So you guys are hip to a lot of it. So I'm going to start with this really interesting graph. So what this graph is, are you guys, if you're not able to see the bottom, what it is it lists every drug. So what this was about 10 years ago, a bunch of researchers got together in the UK. And they decided we're going to take a look at all the scientific evidence based on how bad is something in terms of being addictive. How likely is it to kill you with overdose? How likely is it to make you ruin your life, etc. And we're going to rank the most dangerous to least dangerous, regardless of how dangerous it actually is. Also, I'm happy to share most of these slides with you. So email me later on. I'm happy to email them if you like. So as you can probably not see here, actually I'll cover up and pretend most of you guys can't read it. Where do you think cannabis is? Front row, that's cheating. Yeah, there's cannabis. Now, here's a few interesting things. So, top three, as you'd expect, heroin, the most dangerous. So being that in terms of like very limited medical use, super dangerous. Cocaine is second, barbiturates is third. Then methadone, which is kind of street methadone, which is like a form of heroin. Then fifth is alcohol. Then we go to 6, 7, 8, 9 is tobacco. Then 10, 11 is cannabis. So comes the question, how did we get there? Given the fact that we tend to think that the things that are going to be more difficult to get are going to be the things that are the worst for us, how is it that this one's in the middle, while alcohol, which causes all kinds of problems, is actually completely legal? Now, what the people who wrote this article said, I'm just going to read here. Sorry, it's a little bit of a wordy slide. So this is British. So in Britain, the way it works is they have Class A, Class B, Class C, which is kind of like our Schedule 1, Schedule 2, Schedule 3 in terms of dangerousness. Our findings raise questions about the validity of current classification, despite the fact that it's nominally based on an assessment of risk to users as society. The discrepancies between our findings and current classifications are especially striking in relation to psychedelic type drugs. Our results also emphasize that the exclusion of alcohol and tobacco from Misuse of Drugs Act, which is our Controlled Substances Act, is, from a scientific perspective, completely arbitrary. We see no clear distinction between socially acceptable and illicit substances. The fact that the two most widely used legal drugs lie in the upper half of the ranking of harm is surely important information that should be taken into account in debate on illegal drug use. And we should basically have these laws based on the science and the evidence, not these a priori assumptions that we have. So that's the direction we're moving, and that's very much what legalization is actually kind of hoping to do. So talking a little bit about the question I raised before, why are some substances legal and some not? Just when you're looking in general at this, you need to look at it at many, many layers, because I think that we often say it's the pharmaceutical industry, it's if it's medical or not, if it's a matter of who's using it or not. The fact is it's really multi-layered. There are a lot of things that go into making the history of something. It's kind of the convergence of a bunch of different streams. So first we have the properties of the substance. In particular, when we're talking about something like cannabis, the medical and behavioral. The question of, are you going to become addicted? Are you going to ruin your life? On top of that, we then have the question of who's using it, like you mentioned. Why are they using it? Are they using it medically or are they using it for fun? And cultural perceptions of use and inebriation. Now, this is an interesting one, because let's say if I were to go to the Super Bowl and light up a joint, would that work?
That'd be fun.
That would be mad fun, except I'd be spending the whole time online getting snacks. But the problem is that I would probably get arrested if the Super Bowl is anywhere where federal law enforcement is present. However, I could get tanked on beer, and that is totally fine. And if you go to, general American culture, we think it's fine to get drunk, it's not fine to get high. Or now that's something that's starting to change. Something that for you guys is interesting is the idea that 30 years ago, the idea of having a smoke-free campus where you couldn't smoke tobacco would have been insane. Yet that's what we have right now. So it works both ways in terms of cultural perceptions of what's good and what's not. Then there's this question of activism and regulation that gets to your point about special interests. So the idea that we have these ideas about this is harmful, this is good for you, this is bad for you, these are consequences. But then we have some people who are going to say, it's worth my while to spend a lot of money doing this. Or I think it is really going to be damaging to public safety. We have to make this public priority number one to control this, or not. And then on top of that, we have all this other stuff, economic interest. So all of these things that if any of you were interested in reading my book or other histories of narcotics, when you come to the question of why are some drugs legal and some not, these are the things you come up with. So economic interest, the thing that came up before is if I make aspirin, I don't want Bayer on the market. Political interest. So let's say it's World War II, and I'm the United States, and I know that Germany is making a lot of morphine. I want to get rid of the morphine market because I don't want Germany to do well in the war. There are political interests involved in that. Professional interests. So you mentioned the pharmaceutical. It's another big one in the history of drugs as we know it that's big, is until the 19th century, there was no such thing as a pharmacist. You would go to the grocery store and you would just buy whatever. What happened in the late 19th century was a bunch of people got together and said, you know what, we're the experts in this and we want to have the right to be the only ones who can sell these dangerous things. Give us a license, pay us a lot of money. That is how pharmacy developed into its own thing. So what we had was that kind of development as well. Then the last two is that it's not a historical accident that the drug laws that we have started in the late 19th, early 20th century. Any history majors in here? Good for you, you'll all have good jobs. Oh, art history. All right, drop it. No. So a big thing, if you look at just the history of kind of the Europe and North America, late 19th century is a time when there was a lot of progressive movement and the idea that the state makes a difference. So before that, there was the idea that if you get sick, it's your own problem. Late 19th century is when we start to have this idea that, you know what, the job of government should be to promote the well-being of its citizens. So doing things like having kids go to school until 12th grade. That's not something that happened until then. Part of that was also saying that if people are poisoning themselves, we have to let them know and try to stop them from doing it. We have to provide health care. So we have this desire to kind of make society better that really was well-intentioned. But part of that was this thought that drugs can be really dangerous, let's regulate it. And also during this time, do you guys know when alcohol prohibition was? 20s and 30s. Very much part of the same movement. So the same movement that led to drugs being illegal was really part and parcel of the same one that led to alcohol being illegal for a period of time. Then there's a history of how alcohol became legal again, whereas the other substances didn't. Also, this idea of medical versus non-medical. This is something we always talk about, like with Prop 64, it's saying there's a medical is Prop 64 going to have a difference between medical and non-medical?
There is an adult use and a medical use.
Adult use and medical use. So right there, we have a value judgment, implicit in it still, saying that if you're using it just to get high for fun, that's one thing. If you're using it because you're dealing with pain from your chemotherapy, that's another thing. Now, one thing we know is that, first of all, that's very much an arbitrary dichotomy. Can I ask a personal question? How many people in here smoke weed? Off the record. Okay. How many people do it when you're feeling stressed out and you feel like you need to relax? How many people do it to celebrate the fact that it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday? Exactly.
Happy Wednesday, everyone.
Yeah, happy Wednesday. So, yeah, where's mine? Sorry. So anyway, the point being that we know a lot of people who we think of as using medically. The idea of I use it to blow off steam. I use it when I'm stressed out. Those of us in the medical school would say, hey, you're using it to deal with your anxiety. That's maladaptive coping on your part. Yet the way you view it is it's a tool the same way that when I'm stressed out, maybe I try to sleep more, exercise, whatever. That's how you guys use it. So it's very much an arbitrary line that we realize isn't there. Now also the other thing is we think of this idea of medical and recreational as different things. But back in the day, and we'll talk about this, the idea of being a philosopher, a writer, a movie maker, all these people kind of shared the same circles. Like the lines between recreational and cultural things weren't as different as medical as it was now, largely because things weren't prescribed in the same way. And then the question that I bring up before 1900, you would get these things, you go to the store, you say there's the sugar, there's the baking soda, there's the heroin. So if you're buying it that way, then is that a medicine or is that a recreational product? How do you treat the stuff you buy at GNC? Is that a medicine? Is that a recreational product? So pharmacy as we know it is really a modern creation. And then the big thing also to remember is that until 1900, often these things, the idea of like buying straight cannabis was like the idea of I'm gonna purchase straight chocolate. Yeah, sometimes you would have straight chocolate, but usually you have chocolate as an ingredient in something else. For most of history, when cannabis was used, it wasn't straight pack a bowl and smoke it. It was an ingredient. You would mix it with other stuff and consume it that way. So the whole idea of we're gonna make cannabis illegal is kind of like saying, I don't know, the war on Splenda that I'm suffering now. The idea that like we're gonna take an ingredient and kind of make it illegal rather than the entire substance. Sorry, that Splenda metaphor was weird. Okay, with that, here's a public service message. Have you guys seen this? We have no sound anyway.
It's the one where they're like, you're gonna die.
Yeah, totally. Reefer Madness. Okay, well, we have no soundtrack. Anyway, it's like really great. Google it. YouTube it, Snapchat it, whatever. Okay. Any questions so far? Comments so far? Yes.
Where does like psilocybin fall on that scale of
Ooh.
harmfulness?
It's a good question. So psilocybin and psychedelics like LSD, pretty low actually, because here's the thing. Those things can be really bad for you if you're at risk for kind of developing psychosis. And those things can be bad for you if you're gonna jump off a building because you think you can fly. However, you're unlikely to become a psilocybin addict. You're unlikely, anyone here use LSD every day? Yeah. No, I mean, for me, I went to a school that was pretty crunchy, and the people who use shrooms would shroom once a week, tops. You know, the nature of the substance is one where you're not going to use it so often that it causes damage. And when they talk about the damage, it's damage to your mental health, and also drugs are hard on your body. So the whole thing, like you hear about this with alcohol, and there is some with cannabis, hate to break it to you, is that it's hard on your body. So when they calculate this kind of risk, that's one thing that they talk about. And those psychedelics tend to not really do that kind of damage, mainly because of how they're used.
Yeah, where would you put caffeine on that same scale?
Caffeine is there. Where would I put it? We could flip back and see if you want.
Yeah.
And we can look for psilocybin too while we're at it. Okay, we have COT, GHB, because GHB, again, you guys know what GHB is? Roofies. Yeah, so dangerous, but I'm not gonna take roofies all the time, probably. Steroids, LSD is here. Okay. I don't see caffeine. But I'll have you know that in the time when they started doing research on addiction, you could find this doctor who was the world expert on addiction would have a chapter on heroin, chapter on cannabis, chapter on coffee, chapter on alcohol, chapter on sugar, chapter on biting your nails.
Yeah.
Like they kind of didn't know, so they kind of had everything in there. But according to this, at least, caffeine not there. Yeah.
Do they have sugar on that?
They don't. Not on this list. This list is simply of psycho. Well, it's interesting because this idea of psychoactive. So what kind of makes this list is this idea that it impacts how your brain works. It impacts the neurotransmitters, releases dopamine. Interesting, sugar is there. There are people, there's a researcher up at UCSF who makes the argument that the strategies that Mars uses to get kids addicted to Snickers bars and the strategies they use to get people to eat potato chips, they use the same neurotransmitters that tobacco and alcohol do. So there's more of an argument these days that they should be on this list, but they're not. And I think a major difference is that when you drink, you're not drinking for nutritional value, generally. Like you might consume alcohol incidentally, but generally it's hard to say, I'm gonna have a regular diet with no sugar whatsoever. I'm gonna have a diet with things that don't affect my brain at all. That's kind of where they draw the line. Yeah?
How do the risks change when you combine different substances? Like if you combine tobacco and cannabis, or like cannabis and alcohol?
They multiply.
They multiply?
Mm-hmm. Different ones vary, but in particular, the risk that grows the most is when you multiply two things that kind of do the same thing. So, for example, when you hear about opioid overdoses, the biggest risk of an opioid overdose is if someone's taking a benzodiazepine, so something like Klonopin, Ativan, or if you're drunk at the same time. So, in terms of the risk, this is just individual substance. But in terms of the dangers of substances, it's polysubstance use, using a bunch of stuff at the same time is the most dangerous. Very good questions. And I'm glad I studied the addiction stuff, so I know some of this. Other questions? All right. In terms of time and interest, do you want to go through all the details of the, what do you call it? The ancient Chinese and whatnot?
Oh, sure, yeah. You're cool.
I am cool. But we want to do it? Okay. Great. So we'll skip that. Okay, so let's get back to the history. So you guys, and you guys in the industry, you know the pitch. Cannabis has been used for millennia. People used it back in ancient China. Jesus used it, yada, yada, yada. Who knows? A lot of it. But we do know some stuff. It is true that cannabis has been used by millennia. Originally cultivated Central Asia, like Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, the stands. Around there, that's where it started. Was cultivated in China 6,000 years ago. And again, they didn't view it as like, hey man, let's get high. They viewed it as, here's a plant. Let's use it to make clothes. Let's smoke it. Let's eat it. Let's do whatever with it. And they used it mainly as a medicine, and particularly to treat malaria. It's a problem like in Southeast China. However, its history was pretty minor. So yeah, it's been around in Chinese civilization for 6,000 years. However, if you were to walk around in ancient Beijing, or Peking I guess it was then, most people would have known what alcohol is, they would have known what opium is, and then they would have said, cannabis? Oh, you mean that green stuff I see at the weird market? Yeah, I guess, whatever. Like, it wasn't really that big a deal for them. Where it kind of became a big deal was India. So the first written record of cannabis, kind of as we know it, as like a psychoactive substances, I'm hearing some endorsement of that in the room here, was in India. So there was some, I did not write down the name of it, but like a major historical work that was written sometime between 2000 and 1400 BC that makes mention of cannabis. And they used it in different ways. And it was interesting because it broke down kind of along these class lines. So most folks would use it kind of as an ingredient in a drink, this stuff called bang, I don't know if folks know the pronunciation. And what it was is you take some water and milk, and you mix it with some shui, along with some sugar or pepper and other stuff like that. And it would be mildly psychoactive. Then you had other folks who were starting to use it a little heavier. So the term ganja is a term that comes from India. What that is the female tops of the plant, which is the psychoactive stuff. Then you have charas, which is like pure resin, so kind of what we think of today as hash oil, all being used then. And this was what they call the first cannabis-oriented culture, where they specifically said like, hey, this is a drug that does stuff. So what were some of the ways they did it? Well, they use it to treat disease, so particularly like for today, it's very good at managing pain. It's also good if you're bored, if you're tired. In particular, one thing we see a lot with this and other drugs, used before battle. So the whole idea that if I'm about to go into a slaughter, and remember, this isn't like the kind of battles we have today where people are like using remote controls and just pushing buttons from bunkers. This is like going, sword fights, clawing at each other's eyes. You gotta be pretty ramped up to do this kind of battle. Something they often did was with a lot of drugs, but including cannabis, was before I'm gonna go and do these horrible things, I'm gonna get smashed. So like, no, little known fact. So, like the most prominent example, you guys know the Nazis, World War II. Before they went and they would do a massacre, the first thing they would issue people, they would issue them bullets and a bottle of vodka. For a reason. Because of the fact that you'll tend to do terrible things if you're kind of drunk, kind of smashed. So, over time what happened was the use of bhang was tolerated, but the stronger stuff not so much. Now also, for the history buffs in the room, as you know, India was a British colony for a while. The British, when they were in India, in large part they said, no. Don't do that. That's bad. It makes you unruly. It makes people steal, whatever. But then they said, oh, you know what? Let's put a tax on it. Go ahead. Have some. So it gets at this question of economic interest, where on the one hand, they're thinking this is really bad, but on the other, we can make money off of it. It's something we see a lot. Then cannabis has moved to the West. I'm glad this map is light because the dates are wrong, but the arrows are correct, in terms of kind of showing like how did cannabis spread across the world. So there's references to it, and you see, do you guys watch Dazed and Confused, or am I dating myself?
Yeah.
So it's like when they talk about George Washington, he grew weed, yada, yada, yada. He grew hemp on his farm, fair enough. But there are references to it here and there. And historians, what they tend to do, and you guys in the industry, I hate to pick on you, but they say, oh, you know, Plato smoked it. No, Plato mentioned a mystical green herb that made people laugh. And then historians go back and say, you know what, that's probably pot. It's that kind of stuff. There are references, though, even potentially in the Bible. Use where it did become more prominent was in the Islamic world. And this is an area where there actually was some initial effort to repress it because it was used particularly among the Sufi sect. You guys hear about Sufi Islam these days. It was kind of considered like mystical, kind of dangerous and unorthodox. And the Sufis used it because one way that people often use these drugs is the idea that if I want to talk to God, a good way to do it is to use psilocybin, cannabis, some kind of psychedelic. And they used it that way. The religious folks kind of thought this was really, what's the word, blasphemous, really against God's will. So they tried to repress it. But it didn't work, and over the centuries, cultivation spread. So as Islam spread, Islam starts here in Saudi Arabia, spreads like this. With the spread of Islam, particularly through Africa, we have cannabis go along with it. And particularly along Eastern Africa, so where today we have like Somalia, Ethiopia, places like that, as well as Southern Africa, we start seeing cannabis use increase. In particular, it was more common in these areas to smoke cannabis than tobacco. Now, also another area where there is actually evidence of cannabis's use is the materia medica, which from about the year 0-ish until about 1600 was kind of like what the pharmacist would have. It was the idea of if a doctor wanted to know, what do I treat for this, what do I use for that, they would say, use 2 pinches of saffron, 3 pinches of pepper, 2 pinches of cannabis for an earache. It was like that kind of recipe book, because that's what medicine was back then. It was very much just like mixing and matching different plants. Cannabis is an ingredient in a lot of the things mentioned in this text. So the whole thing of like, oh, Europeans were using it. They weren't smoking dope, but they were taking preparations whenever they had a headache, or whenever they had a cough or a migraine, or they were giving birth. They would take a medicine, and cannabis was one of the ingredients in it. Wrong way. This clicker's not again. Now, cannabis came west with Columbus. Well, not directly, actually. So the Europeans, when they came here, didn't originally grow in North America. I mean, there was some Native American use, but really the Europeans, when they came over, like 1600s, 1700s, they cultivated North America, South America. Now, what's interesting is they actually grew more cannabis in North America, but the stuff that they grew, they were like, we're gonna use it to make rope and stuff like that. We're gonna use it to make clothes. They were also growing it in South America. Now, the reason cannabis use took off in South America and not North America, South America, their slave trade, the slaves that they got, were from Eastern Africa. So the slaves who wound up in South America were ones who were from parts of Africa where they smoked cannabis. So they came over, and then they're working in the fields, and the slave masters just say, hey, you want to smoke this stuff on your downtime? Cool, whatever. So it took root in South America. In North America, the slaves we had here were more from Western Africa. So like Guinea, around there, Guyana, around there. Those places were places where cannabis use hadn't spread. So it's basically places where in Africa cannabis was used, wherever those slaves wound up, is kind of where it took root in North America. And then over the centuries, what you have is that it starts to spread, just gradually. It's kind of like, I'm in the fields, I'm smoking it, give it to this guy at market, et cetera, et cetera. Sorry, I keep doing that. So this was my point on this. Now, it spread to the Caribbean, again, when we brought in some new people. So what happened is we established slavery. History fact, when did we abolish slavery? 1865, very good, okay. The British were ahead of us. So the British had colonies in what's today like Cuba, Jamaica, Bermuda, that area. They abolished slavery in 1838. Now, the reason I bring this up is originally they had enslaved the people who lived on these islands. What they did in 1838, suddenly they didn't have slaves, so they needed to import some cheap labor. They went to their colony in India. Remember where they smoked a lot of pot? It was India. So the whole thing of pot being connected with Jamaica and Rastas and all that stuff, the reason is a lot of the folks in these parts of the world came over from India and they brought the cannabis habit with them. So essentially what we have is areas where people were using, and where these people go, the cannabis came with them. And then it came to the US mainly, not really until the early 20th century, when we had an influx of Mexican labor here. Also, you guys know the Panama Canal. So there's a lot of stories of US authorities first becoming familiar with it because there were soldiers down in the Panama Canal who were suddenly getting high because of the fact that there was a lot of stuff there. Now, I'll pause for any questions so far. Yes?
I believe it was from 1700 all the way up to 1400. The Moors from Africa were ruling Spain. Was there any cannabis use there, or?
It's interesting. I've seen some references to that, and essentially when the Moors were kicked out of Spain in the 1400s, that's when kind of the use decreased. But yeah, I mean, there was some. I think that it was much more common in the Muslim Empire than it was in other parts of the old world. Yeah.
Regardless of its legal status, would you say that it's been pretty widespread, regardless of how society viewed it, or how? Yeah.
Well, because here's the thing. It's this question of where is it available. So remember, the whole story is that what we're up to here, say the year 1900, you only have cannabis where there's people from places where cannabis was originally smoked. So that's India, the Middle East, and the eastern part of Africa. So we don't have a lot of those folks living in Wyoming in 1880, So it's very much a matter of where are the people. So the whole thing, it's not so much that people thought it was good or bad or that it did social harm, it's just no one was doing it. And we'll get to that, because that's a point that actually comes into the Prohibition. Yeah?
Did it only grow naturally in those regions?
I believe people cultivated it. I mean, I think where it originally grew naturally was in that middle Asia, part of Asia, but part of what made it such a good crop, more for like clothing and stuff like that, but in general, is it's a really strong blend. So these foreign people are doing. So one of the most prominent things, and I mentioned this, I'll bring it up with the last point. So Marco Polo, the first guy who went around the world, I guess he was. So he did some travels, and what he did is in the course of his travels, he heard this story about these people in Turkey who were crazy, mean, kind of this religious sect that would go around murdering people like crazy. And what he heard was that there was some kind of drug that they took when they did it. Now the name of this group was actually the Assassins. So the term assassin today comes from that. Now, what a lot of people later on said is the term assassin comes from the term hashishin, so that it's connected. Now, the reason I bring this up, this would seem obscure, except for the fact that you could read a medical textbook in 1910 that would talk about, the first mention of cannabis is the crazy hashishins who would smoke cannabis and then go massacre people. So this is a story that got passed down during the generations, and it's something you see throughout a lot of history, is things that start as what we would think of as urban legend, get repeated enough until they start to become real. It's kind of like a precedent, I know. Anyway, but it established this. Also, here's a reference from a Portuguese traveler talking about a trip to India. One mention in his diary. The Indians get usefulness from this, talking about cannabis, unless it's in the fact that they become ravished by ecstasy and delivered from all worries and cares, and laugh at the least little thing. It's like, all right, fair enough. Now, so this is all in the 1600s, but it's still a curiosity. Where it starts to change, and I might be a little biased here because my specialty was French history, but it was actually France in the 19th century. So there's this guy, Jacques-Joseph Moreau du Tour, who's one of the founders of modern psychiatry. In Paris, aristocratic guy, wore fancy colors, all that. Now, one thing that he believed as a psychiatrist was that if I'm going to treat my patients, I need to know what their craziness is like. So what's a way for me to know what it's like to be hallucinating is to take a drug. And he had done some traveling in North America where he tried it, and he was like, you know what, being high is kind of like being crazy. Let's try this. So what he did is he used it himself, he liked it, and he also used it with some of the patients he was working with. Now, one thing he did though is he noticed, I'm sitting there and getting high, and then I wake up in the morning, I don't know what's happening. So you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna have a bunch of buddies come over and take notes and watch me while I'm high, so they can tell me what's happening. So this is how the Hashish Eaters Club started. So literally, what this was in Paris in like the 1850s, these rich aristocratic guys got together and got high and then talked about what happened. And they wrote it down. This is what they did. Now, this is important again because the way that they recorded it, their observations are kind of the bedrock. Like I talked about the urban legend aspect of it. What you have is like, if I'm gonna study something, I'm gonna look at what people did first. These guys were the original ones who did it. So these are the original guys who wrote it down. And what these guys did was they hung out in this fantastic apartment in like a really, really swanky part of Paris. And they ate this green cannabis jam, which is kind of what they ate in like North Africa at the time, because that's what they had. And then they hung out. And they said, what do you see? What are you thinking about? So they got stoned and talked, basically. And that's what it was. And because of that, hashish appears in a lot of French literatures, because these guys weren't a bunch of schleps. So guys like Rimbaud, Baudelaire, Balzac. Any French literature buffs in the room? Really? I know Balzac, kid. Yes. Anyway, okay, do you guys know...
The Little Prince? I know that French book.
Oh, that's Saint-Exupéry. Do you guys know Les Mis?
Yes.
Victor Hugo. Club de Hashish.
No way.
True story. Okay, I just planted another urban legend here now. But yeah, so it was basically a who's who, because this was like these are still aristocrats kind of who were doing this kind of thing. Now, I'm gonna get the clicker right. A guy who I again clicked wrong. There we go. So someone who I think of as kind of one of the godfathers of a lot of this is Charles Baudelaire. So this ties in with, again, I'm going to nerd out on intellectual history with you guys for a minute. Anyone know the Romantics? Okay, tell me about the Romantics.
It was like an emphasis on nature as a way to like connect with God, and like emphasis on aesthetic beauty.
So focus on beauty, focus on nature. And one thing these guys were really into was figuring out what are ways that I can experience beauty beyond what I'm currently experiencing. So a big thing is they said, my body is a prison. What if there's beauty that I can experience beyond what I can see, beyond what I can hear? Now again, what do you think is a great way to do that? Drugs. Drugs are really good for that. So there were a lot of people in England who did this kind of stuff, a lot of people in France who did it. Now what's notable about this guy, Baudelaire, famous, like one of the giants of French literature in the 19th century, is he tried a lot of drugs, and he wrote about them. And he wrote essays saying, this is what it's like to be drunk, this is what it's like to be high, this is what it's like to be on opium, this is what's good about each, this is what's bad about each. And again, kind of the starting the urban legend. Then if I'm a doctor and I want to know what's it like to be high, I'm going to read what this guy wrote. So what is it that he said? Well, he said a few things. Actually, when we think about why did hashish kind of become the bad guy, let's look at what he said. He said, alcohol is something that makes you very happy. Alcohol is something that's good to go, hang out with your buddies, have a good time. When you smoke pot, you get isolated. All you want to do is sit in the corner and not talk to anyone. So if we think about this question of the idea of understanding how the intoxication works and whether we think it's good or bad, that right there is a big difference right there. That's kind of a fork in the road, as I see it, in terms of the way we view it. So also, the way that he described it, it's kind of true, but it's also a little scary. So what's it like to be high? What he wrote, hilarity, ridiculous, and irresistible seizes you. This seizure of groundless gaiety of which you're almost ashamed occurs over and over, cutting through intervals of stupor when you vainly try to recollect yourself. After a short time of quietude comes a cool sensation in the extremities. Then the senses become distorted, and really what he says is hashish is a chaotic evil. So saying, yeah, it's kind of pleasurable, but it's kind of crazy at the same time. You lose control compared to other substances. Now also we have this in the US. And what's interesting about this is, you guys, I'm gonna date myself again, but kind of, you know, the Nancy Reagan, just say no kind of stuff, the story of addiction. The story of addiction that we get in like prevention messaging is this idea that it seemed fun, I tried it, it was fun, then I couldn't stop, and then I had to give it up. This is very much like the way we think of addiction today. That's the story of it. So this is a guy writing in 1857, one of the first Americans to write in detail about pot. Here's what he said. He said, my first experiment of the use, it was simply from being curious. I decided to try it out. Then there was a gradual change of my motive for its employment and the desire of research to the fascinated longing for its weird and immeasurable ecstasy. In other words, I really liked it and I kind of wanted some more. That ecstasy by degrees becomes daily more and more flecked with shadows as of immeasurable pain, but still in this dual existence assumed a character increasingly apocalyptic of utter unpreconceived provinces of mental action. So again, it's like, I feel like I'm going crazy. Am I tripping? What's happening here? It's kind of scary, I want it to stop. Then torture, save at rare intervals, without abating in the least fascination of the habit. Fascination of the habit in 19th century is basically saying I'm going through withdrawal. I need it, I'm obsessed with it, I want some more. And then my instantaneous abandonment of the indulgence, the cause which led to it, and the discipline of suffering which attended the self-denial. So I gave it up, and it was hard. So what you see here is someone describing hashish the way we would think of like heroin, something like that. What he's talking about is I danced with the devil, it got the best of me, I had to quit. So when we think about, even though we know that physiologically, going back to that chart, it's not really that harmful, cultural representations of it have made it look that way. Now, in terms of what it was actually like in the daily life for most folks, again, like I mentioned, it was an ingredient. So here's a picture of a compound for corns, which I guess is like those things on your foot. There was pot, there was cannabis in it, along with other stuff. It was still relatively minor though, because the main thing people used was opiates. That was the big kind of pain reliever at the time. A lot of what changed to make it less desirable was even before drugs became illegal, a big game changer in it was A, we realized drugs were dangerous, but also they invented this thing called aspirin. So suddenly once they had that, I didn't have to take morphine if I had a headache anymore. There was this like nice little pill I could take that was pretty harmless. With that, I'll pause for questions. Yeah.
Just one thing, we have 15 minutes left. Just wanted to let you know.
Okay, any questions? Okay, I'll run through it. So, move to Prohibition, what happened? We talked about a lot of this stuff already. The last point is a key one as well. 19th century is a time when people start leaving the farm, start working in factories. It's a time when we have the Civil War, we have World War I, we have World War II coming up down the road. So this is a time when if I work in the government, it matters if you're hungover. It matters if you're too high to do your job. This is a matter of national security now, if you're too messed up. So 1914, Harrison Act was the first drug laws in the US. Now the Harrison Act actually specifically did not include marijuana. It included opiates and cocaine. So the question is why? First of all, no one was smoking pot at the time, really. It was like not really that heard of. Also, getting to the point that was made earlier about industrial interests. A lot of people who said, hey, you know what? I use hemp to make clothes. I have it as this little ingredient in this like ointment and it's not getting anyone high. So don't make it illegal. So they didn't. Now what changed was, again, people who were using cannabis coming into the equation. So historical fun fact, 1910, big revolution in Mexico. A lot of refugees come up to the US. Mexico is a place where they had been smoking a lot of cannabis. As a result, we start seeing more and more of it, and it kind of gets blended together with, I don't like that Mexican coming in. I don't like that Mexican taking my job. Again, it's like, I never hear anything like that these days. It's very strange. So what we have is the association of the drug with these people these folks that people are worried about. Also, is very much in the 20s started to be used by like jazz musicians, again, African Americans. So very much mixed with racial anxiety, this anxiety about the drug. Also, psychiatrists would then go to scientific meetings and say, if you smoke pot, it's going to make you gay. People, they were worried about it.
How much anxiety would you say was caused by the government, like deliberately trying to cause like, you know, group stereotypes together and get rid of them, or would you say it was just like a thing that happened organically?
I think it's human nature. I mean, I think that it's interesting because a lot of the mythology of the anti-cannabis movement from the government is that there were bureaucrats in Washington who decided to orchestrate this thing.
Yeah.
And get it together. However, what we see is that it really was a matter of local prejudice. And so there's definitely prejudice and there's definitely a campaign, but it wasn't folks in Washington. It's like you read my mind as to what's coming next. So this is from a period when cannabis wasn't illegal yet. And what you have is police chiefs, governors from the West, where I had this town of 200 people and now I have 150 Mexicans living here. These are the kind of things they're complaining about to the federal government. So one letter. Really, as you can see, they're complaining about cannabis, they're complaining about the immigrants at the same time. I wish I could show you what a small marijuana cigarette can do to one of our degenerate Spanish-speaking residents. That's why our problem is so great. The greatest percentage of our population is composed of Spanish-speaking persons, most of whom are low mentally because of social and racial conditions. While marijuana has figured in the greatest number of crimes in the past few years, officials fear it not for what it has done, but for what it's capable of doing. They want to check it before an outbreak occurs. So prettily openly saying, we're racially superior to these folks who are coming in. A lot of racial anxiety being tied in with the idea that there's this thing that they're doing. When I drink beer, I'm good. I'm just a hearty fellow who's having fun. But when the Mexican guy next door smokes pot, he's going to go and he's going to rape and kill my kids. So it's kind of this fear of the foreign that's tied with the substance. So that's kind of where it ties together. Another example. So this was from an anti-immigrant group, actually in Sacramento. Good to know California. We had some good folks here. Writing to the federal government in 1935. Marijuana, perhaps now the most insidious of our narcotics, is a direct byproduct of unrestricted Mexican immigration. Easily grown, it's been asserted that it has recently been planted in rows in a California penitentiary garden. Mexican peddlers have been caught distributing sample marijuana cigarettes to our school children. So again, what we're using is we're having this, I don't like having the immigrants here and I'm afraid of mixing with society, and the drug kind of being a nice vehicle for people to talk about this anxiety. So what we have is kind of lobbying of the federal government, the same way that when we want something done, we write our congressman. That's what these guys were doing. And these are kind of local respected citizens in various places. So at first the federal government, it's these guys in Washington, D.C., where there aren't that many Mexican folks. So they're saying, this isn't a big deal. But political pressure built. And then eventually they passed the Marijuana Tax Act in 1937, which is the beginning of marijuana prohibition. What it was is it didn't make it illegal to use it, but it said if you're gonna have marijuana, you have to have a special stamp from the government, and we're not gonna give the stamp to anybody. So they kind of circumvented it that way by controlling the sale. I'm just gonna run through the last few slides quickly to get us up to 1970. So what happened is, even though it was illegal, as you guys know, the 50s and 60s is when cannabis culture, the way we think of it, really started. Now, where it became different is with the Beats and with the hippies. So those folks we looked at before, like Baudelaire, who talked about marijuana is this powerful stuff, but it's kind of weird and bad. These guys said, anyone who's telling you marijuana is bad is lying to you, and it's awesome, and you should go out and do it. So they actively were encouraging people to do it. Really saying, as Allen Ginsberg was quoted, anyone who tells you that drugs are bad is in a fog of dirty language, and they're a crowd of fakers. So these are kind of the cool kids in the 50s and 60s, the cultural avant-garde. And then, obviously, we have the 60s. We have the flower people, the opposition to Vietnam. We have hippies. Also, at the same time, you have an increase in popular culture. So in 1920 or 1930, you would have only seen reference to marijuana like in that movie that'll make you go crazy and kill yourself. Now suddenly we have in movies people smoking joints casually, the same way they're drinking. Cultural representations of it started to change. And a big thing in terms of the boom was, you guys know about the baby boom, baby boomers? So it's effectively after World War II, after the Depression, people came home, they had a lot of kids. So what we had is a huge amount of the US population was in like their late teens or early 20s in the 60s. And what's a good thing to start doing in your late teens and early 20s? It's exactly this. So in part it's a cultural thing, but it's also a demographic thing, that we had a lot of the population at exactly that point. And also people had a lot more money, so they were able to do it. Now, here's 1970. So when people say 1970 is when it became illegal, that is actually today's drug laws are based on a 1970 overhaul that we did. And basically it did a lot of things, but one thing that they did was they placed cannabis on Schedule 1. So getting back to this question of harm, what they did was say Schedule 1 is a substance that has no legitimate use. It's not useful in medicine, it's not useful in anything. So that's heroin, that's LSD, that's marijuana. The question is why? Now it was interesting, a couple of years ago there was an interview with someone who worked with President Nixon on crafting this, and this is basically the smoking gun. You guys might have heard this headline when it came out. The Nixon campaign in 1968, the Nixon White House after, had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying. We couldn't make it illegal to be against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, we could raid their homes, we could break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So again, we kind of have this association with people and using the drug, it's kind of a vicious circle, using the drug to demonize the people and using the people to demonize the drug. What's going on? Two things going on here. Now, people kind of smelled that this was BS pretty quickly. So in 1972, just a couple years later, they had a commission that said, does marijuana really belong on the list with LSD and heroin? Is it that bad? And in essence, I won't run through it too much, but the answer was no. They said, this isn't that bad. Let's reschedule it. Let's allow for some medical use. Let's not criminalize it as much. And President Nixon read it and then decided, I don't care, and threw it in the trash bin. As a result, marijuana became part of the war on drugs, the black market, mass incarceration, everything we know about today. So, why does this history matter? So it shows, obviously, things other than public health and safety were often driving marijuana policy. Led to people who needed it medically not getting it, violence, community disruption, war on drugs, yada, yada, yada. And also getting back to that point that it's not really rational. At the same time, and this is the thought for all of you who are going to be entering the industry, I'm going to turn into public service, Howard, now. So, people say, let's regulate it just like alcohol. And I'd say most of you interested in the industry, I assume that's an argument you make or have heard often. So here's my challenge to you. Makes sense. You know, prohibition of alcohol failed. Everyone drinks, it's not a problem, right? Well, let's take a look at that. Has legalization of alcohol really been a success? Alcohol today is the third leading cause of preventable death in the United States. Alcohol today is involved in 3 million arrests each year. People say, oh, we can tax and regulate it, because the big thing you say is, oh, cannabis will be legal, we can tax and regulate it. We bring in $15 billion a year in alcohol tax revenue, but the cost to incarcerate people, treat them, all that stuff, is $250 billion. So is that really a good deal? So the whole thing of like, let's use alcohol as a model, not really working, and the question is why? The reason is, when we legalized alcohol, we said, cool, sell it. We didn't tax it enough, and we didn't take the money from the taxes and invest it in a way to make sure that it didn't wreak havoc on society. So instead, we have a world where there are bar fights, people are beating their wives and children, etc., largely fueled by alcohol. So thinking about what is it we want to do now as we move forward. And my plea, I can tell you, as public health people, they look at the industry, they look at you guys as the bad guys. They look at you guys as the ones who are going to try to just sell it, no matter what. Hopefully we can find a happy medium here, where certainly we don't want to repeat the past mistakes that we talked about, the racism, the denial of access to a medicine. But at the same time, alcohol's not perfect either. So let's learn some lessons about what went wrong with alcohol and try to, as we approach the cannabis industry, do it in a way that promotes public health. And I'm happy in the discussion we have to talk about, as a health researcher, what some of the health concerns are from the perspective of public health and regulation and things like that, because that might be more interesting for you guys than the history stuff, but I'm happy to discuss either. So that's what I got.